The first German to see them was a 19-year-old named Willi Hartmann, and he was holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his fist. It was a little after 5 in the morning. The sky behind the mountain had turned the color of dirty milk, and Willi had walked to the back edge of the position to relieve himself before his officer came around for the morning count. He was thinking about his mother. He was thinking about the smell of the bakery 2 doors down from his house in Regensburg. He was not thinking about the cliff, because nobody on that hill ever thought about the cliff. The cliff was a wall of rock that dropped away for the length of a church tower, and everyone who had ever stood on that hill agreed on one thing. No man alive could climb it. So when Willi looked down and saw 48 faces looking back up at him, his mind refused to accept it. For a full 3 seconds, he simply stared. The faces were dark, smeared with mud and boot polish. The men were pressed flat against a shelf of rock maybe 30 feet below the lip of the position, and they were so still that at first Willi thought he was looking at a trick of the shadows. Then one of them moved. And Willi understood, all at once and in his stomach before his brain, that the enemy was behind the wall. Behind every gun. Behind every sandbag his side had spent a month stacking. The coffee cup slipped out of his hand and bounced once on the stone, and he did not even hear it fall. To understand why that moment ended a battle that heavier things could not, you have to understand the mountain. This was the winter and spring of 1944 in central Italy, on the road that every Allied soldier had learned to hate. The Germans had drawn a defensive line clear across the width of the country, anchored in the high ground above a river valley, and the fist at the center of that line was a mass of stone and ruined stone that the maps called Monte Cassino. On its summit sat the shell of an old monastery. Below the summit, hidden in folds of the slope, sat gun pits and machine gun nests and observation posts that could see for miles. Any army that wanted to march to Rome had to come up that valley. And any army that came up that valley did so under the eyes of men who had all the time in the world to aim. By the time our story begins, the mountain had already swallowed a staggering number of lives. Whole battalions had gone up its slopes and come back as lists of names. Americans, British, Indians, New Zealanders, Poles, Frenchmen, Moroccans. The valley floor was churned to gray soup by shellfire, and the graves registration units could not keep pace. Soldiers who had fought in North Africa, men who thought they had already seen the worst that war could do, would look up at that mountain and go quiet. It was not the size of it. It was the patience of it. The mountain did not need to attack. It only had to wait, and men would keep climbing into its guns because their generals could not think of anywhere else to send them. One position on that mountain had become a small legend of its own. It was not the summit, and it was not the monastery. It was a lower spur, a knuckle of rock jutting out from the main slope, and whoever held it held a clear field of fire across 2 of the approaches that the Allies most wanted to use. The Germans had built into it the way a tick burrows into skin. There were bunkers of poured concrete with walls thick enough to shrug off a direct hit. There were tunnels connecting them so that a man could move from one gun to another without ever showing himself. There were mortar pits sited so carefully that the crews could drop a shell onto a chosen boulder in the dark from memory. The garrison numbered somewhere around 130 men, and they had food and water and ammunition to last them well past any reasonable siege. Their commander was a major named Heinrich Falk. He was 38 years old, and he had the kind of face that gave nothing away. Before the Italian campaign, he had spent 2 brutal years on the Eastern Front, in places where the temperature killed as many men as the enemy did, and he had come out of it with a reputation as an officer who did not lose ground. His men did not love him exactly, but they trusted him the way you trust a good roof in a storm. Falk did not believe in dramatic gestures. He believed in fields of fire, in ranging his weapons before an attack came, in making the enemy pay so heavily for the first 50 yards that they gave up on the other 50. He had done exactly that 3 times over, and each time the bodies at the bottom of his hill had proved him right. The first attempt against Falk's spur had come at night, early on, before anyone respected the place. A company of infantry, close to 200 men, had crept up the main draw in the dark with orders to take the position by surprise. Falk had been expecting them for 2 days. He let the leading files come almost within touching distance of his forward wire, and then his machine guns opened up from 3 sides at once. The draw became a trap with no exit. In the space of a few minutes, the attacking company lost more than a third of its strength, and the survivors spent the rest of the night crawling back down over their own dead, dragging the wounded who could still be dragged. Not one German was so much as scratched. The second attempt tried to solve the problem with metal. Someone at headquarters decided that if flesh could not cross that ground, armor could. A handful of tanks were sent grinding up a track that engineers had cleared on the flank. Falk had guessed that they would try it, and he had spent a week having his men bury anti-tank mines and drag old artillery pieces into hidden positions where they could fire down the length of the track. The lead tank lost a track to a mine and slewed sideways, blocking the 2 behind it. The German gunners, firing at ranges where they could hardly miss, brewed up 2 more before the rest reversed away down the hill in a panic. The wrecks sat on that track for weeks afterward, black and burned out, and every Allied soldier who passed them read the same message. This place eats everything you send it. The third attempt was the one that convinced the commanders they were beaten. If men and machines both failed, then the answer, surely, was fire. For most of a day the Allied artillery hammered the spur. Hundreds of shells came down on those bunkers, so many that the men waiting to attack could feel the ground jump under their boots a mile away. The noise rolled around the valley until it stopped meaning anything. Dust and smoke swallowed the whole position. And when the barrage finally lifted and the observers raised their binoculars, expecting to see a smashed and smoking ruin, they saw a German soldier calmly climb up out of a bunker, look around at the fresh craters, and disappear back inside. The concrete had held. The garrison had simply sat in their tunnels through the whole thing, playing cards by candlelight, waiting for the racket to stop. After 3 failures, the tally against Falk's single spur stood at close to 400 Allied casualties, and the position had been held for 26 days. Every one of those days mattered, because for every day the spur held, the guns on it kept killing men on the rest of the mountain, and the whole advance stayed frozen. The commanders sat in their tents with the maps spread out and turned the same question over and over without finding a way in. How do you break open a box when the walls are too thick to smash and the shells cannot reach the men inside it? They kept asking the question, as if the answer had to be a bigger version of what they had already tried. A heavier gun. More men. Another barrage. Nobody in those tents thought to ask a different kind of question, which was whether the walls even mattered if you could get around behind them. The men who would ask that question had just arrived in the sector, and most of the British officers around them did not expect much. They were Gurkhas, riflemen of a battalion recruited from the hill country of Nepal, and there were 48 of them in the group that mattered to this story. They came from villages perched on the sides of mountains so steep that the fields had to be cut into the slope like steps on a giant staircase. Most of them were in their early 20s. Before the war, they had been herders and farmers, boys who walked barefoot up rock paths at dawn to bring the goats to grass, and walked back down at dusk with loads on their backs that a grown European would have struggled to lift. They had grown up in a place where a careless step did not mean a scraped knee. It meant a long silent fall and a burial with an empty coffin. Height did not frighten them, because height had been the floor of their whole lives. Their leader was a Subadar named Manbahadur Gurung. In the British ranks, a Subadar sat somewhere near the top of the non-commissioned world, senior enough to command real respect, close enough to the men to know each of them by the sound of his laugh. Manbahadur was 31, and he had joined the army at 17, which meant he had been soldiering for half his life. He was not a large man. He was quiet in a way that made loud men uneasy, because he watched everything and said almost nothing, and when he did speak, the words had usually been sitting in his head for a while before they came out. His men would have walked into a river of fire for him, and the reason was simple. In 2 years of fighting across the desert and up the length of Italy, not once had he asked any of them to go somewhere he was not willing to go first. They had watched him carry a wounded rifleman across open ground while bullets kicked dust around his boots, and they had watched him do it without hurrying, as though the enemy were beneath his notice. When the British handed the Gurkhas their first briefing on Falk's Spur, Man Bahadur did not look at the maps the way the officers did. The officers saw the position as a problem of walls and weapons, a fortress that had to be cracked from the front. Man Bahadur saw a hill, and he had spent his whole childhood learning that a hill has more than one side. He asked for permission to go and look at it himself, and the permission was granted with a shrug, because nobody imagined a hill farmer would see anything the staff colleges had missed. For the better part of 2 days, Man Bahadur simply walked. He circled the base of the spur, keeping to cover, studying the rock from every angle the ground would let him reach. He watched where the German sentries showed themselves and, more usefully, where they never did. He noted which slopes were watched and which were merely assumed to be safe. On the second afternoon, he found himself on the far side of the position, the side that faced away from the valley and the fighting, and he stood there for a long time looking up. In front of him, the rock climbed almost straight into the sky. It rose for something close to 360 feet, sheer and pale, with only a scatter of cracks and knobs to break the smoothness of it. No path went up it. No trench guarded it. There was not a single German weapon pointed anywhere near it, and Man Bahadur understood exactly why. To the men on top, that face was not a weakness to be defended. It was a moat that defended itself. Only a fool or a bird would try it. Man Bahadur went back that night with 2 of his best climbers, and in the dark, without ropes, they went up the rock as far as they dared. About 2/3 of the way to the top, roughly 230 feet above the valley floor, his fingers found a ledge. It ran along the face for a good stretch, and at its widest, it was broad enough for men to sit on shoulder to shoulder. Better than that, it sat under an overhang that hid it completely from anyone standing at the lip of the position above. A man could reach that ledge, and a man could wait there, and the Germans 30 feet over his head would never know he was there at all. Man Bahadur climbed back down, sat with the plan for the rest of the night, and by morning he was certain. He would take his men up the cliff in the dark. They would gather on the hidden ledge before dawn, and when the sun came up, they would already be standing behind the strongest fortress on the mountain. He took the idea to his British battalion commander, a colonel named Pemberton, and Pemberton listened to about half of it before his face closed. The colonel was not a cruel man. He genuinely believed he was saving Gurkha lives by refusing. He pointed out, reasonably enough, that each man would be carrying his rifle and his ammunition and his water and the rest of his kit, 60 pounds and more on some of the smaller riflemen, and he asked how anyone was supposed to climb a sheer face under that weight in the dark. He pointed out that if the sun came up before they reached the top, the Germans would lean over the edge and pick them off the rock at their leisure, like a man knocking apples off a wall with a stick. It was suicide dressed up as cleverness, the colonel said, and he would not sign an order that sent brave men to die for a stunt. Man Bahadur did not argue. Arguing was not his way. He asked instead for one small permission, which was to go up the cliff himself at night and prove that the ledge was where he said it was and that men could reach it. Pemberton, thinking nothing would come of it, agreed. And so the plan crept forward one grudging step, while above them the German garrison ate their rations and cleaned their weapons, and had no idea that a shepherd from Nepal had already found the crack in their armor. The trouble was that a battalion colonel could not authorize an operation like this on his own. The idea had to go up the chain, to brigade, and at brigade it hit a wall harder than any Falk had built. The senior officers there had spent a month watching sensible textbook attacks fail on that mountain, and their answer was not to try something stranger, but to demand something bigger. They wanted a proper set-piece assault, with a full artillery program and, if it could be arranged, aircraft. The thought of 48 riflemen creeping up a cliff with knives struck them as something out of a boy's adventure story, not a plan a serious army acted on. Twice Man Bahadur's idea reached them, and twice they sent it back down with the same verdict. Modern war, they said, was won with modern tools, and hill farmers with curved blades were not a tool, whatever they were. There was one man who could not let it go. His name was Alistair Crewe, and he was a young captain attached to the sector as a liaison and intelligence officer, which meant his job was to move between units and understand what was actually happening, rather than what the maps claimed. Crew had been on the valley floor for all 3 of the failed assaults. He had helped compile the casualty returns afterward, which meant he had seen the failures reduced to columns of numbers, and the numbers had done something to him. He knew, with a certainty that his superiors seemed to lack, that nothing they had tried was working, and nothing they were planning to try would work either. He had also spent enough time near the Gurkhas to have lost any illusion that they were merely brave. He had watched Man Bahadur read ground the way other men read a book, and he believed the Subadar had seen something real. Crew did what junior officers are told never to do. He went around the chain of command. He had a friend on the divisional staff, a man with the ear of the general, and he used that friendship without shame. He laid the whole thing out plainly. 3 attacks, 400 casualties, 26 days, and not 1 inch of that spur taken. He asked what 1 more textbook assault would cost, and then he asked what a single night's gamble would cost by comparison. "Give the Gurkhas 1 night," he said. "If the impossible could be done by anyone, it would be done by men who had grown up doing it for a living." The argument was not elegant. It was just true, and sometimes that is enough. Word came back down the chain that the operation was approved. Man Bahadur would have his night. When the Subadar told his men, not one of them flinched. He had half expected some hesitation, because he was an honest enough leader to know the risk he was asking them to run, but the risk did not seem to reach them. They had climbed worse in Nepal for no reward at all, beyond grass for their goats. They had done it in snow, with numb hands, before they were old enough to shave. A warm Italian night on dry rock struck several of them as almost easy, and one of the youngest actually laughed when he heard the plan, not out of nerves, but out of something closer to relief that they were finally being asked to do the one thing they were better at than any army on earth. They did not simply throw themselves at the cliff. Man Bahadur found a similar face a couple of miles behind the lines, well out of German sight, and for 3 nights running, he took his men up it in the dark. They learned to climb blind, feeling for holds their eyes could not find, trusting their fingertips over their vision. They learned to move without sound. Every buckle that could rattle was taped over. Every strap of metal was wrapped in cloth. They practiced passing a warning up the line with a single tug on the shoulder of the man ahead rather than a whisper. By the 3rd night, all 48 could go up that practice cliff in full kit, without a rope, and reach the top having made no more noise than a breath of wind. Now they only had to do it for real, with 130 armed men waiting above them, on a night with no second chance. The operation was set for the middle of May. The sun went down and the men gathered in a dry ditch at the foot of the cliff, and for a while they just waited, letting the last of the light drain out of the sky. They had blackened their faces and hands. They had checked one another's kit twice, tugging on straps, pressing on buckles, hunting for anything that might betray them. Each man carried his rifle slung across his back, his ammunition, 2 water bottles, and at his hip the kukri, the heavy curved knife that every Gurkha carries and that every enemy who has faced one learns to fear. When the last edge of gray had gone from the horizon and the rock had faded into pure black, Man Bahadur touched the shoulder of the first climber, and the first climber reached up, found his first hold, and began. They went up one at a time, spaced out so that a slip by one man would not sweep away the man below him. The rock was cold against their fingers, still holding a little of the day's warmth in its deeper cracks, but chilled on the surface by the night air. It smelled of dust and of the small tough plants that grew in the seams, a sharp herbal smell that several of the men would remember for the rest of their lives. Somewhere far below, water ran over stones with a sound like distant applause. Somewhere far above, 130 men who believed themselves perfectly safe were sleeping or standing watch on the wrong sides of the position, their guns pointed out at a valley that no longer held the real threat. There is a rhythm to climbing that kind of rock in the dark, and every one of these men knew it in his body without having to think. The hand goes up, the fingers search, Brush the stone, find an edge, test it with a careful pull before any weight commits to it. The foot rises, feels for a knob or a crack, presses down slowly to be sure it will bear. The breath stays even. Above all, the mind stays away from the drop. A climber who starts thinking about the emptiness below him has already begun to fall, and these men had learned as children to keep that door in their heads firmly shut. So they climbed, 48 silent shapes strung out across a wall of stone, each one alone in the dark, and each one trusting that the man above him knew the way. About a third of the way up, the face steepened, and the good holds grew fewer and further apart. It was here that one of the younger riflemen made the only mistake of the night. His boot skidded off a sloping ledge, and for a heart-stopping instant, his whole weight hung from his fingers alone. He caught himself, but his foot had knocked a stone loose, and the stone fell. Every man on the cliff heard it go, and every man froze in place, fingers locked, breath held, waiting. The stone bounced once against the rock with a crack that seemed to fill the whole valley, then fell free, and after what felt like an age it landed in soft earth at the bottom with a dull thud and was silent. Above them, nothing. No shout, no sudden light, no boots running to the parapet. The Germans, wrapped in their certainty that the cliff was nothing, had heard a small stone fall and thought nothing of it at all. The young rifleman found a new hold, steadied his breathing, and climbed on, and behind him 47 others did the same. Higher up, the strain began to tell. Fingers that had gripped cold rock for over an hour started to cramp. The weight of the kit dragged at aching shoulders. Sweat ran into eyes despite the cool of the night. But nobody stopped, and nobody signaled for rest, because there was no place to rest and no time to take it. They simply kept moving, one hold at a time, letting the body do what it had been trained to do, while the mind hung on grimly to a single instruction. Find the next hold, then the next after that. The first man reached the hidden ledge and hauled himself onto it, and it was exactly as Man Bahadur had promised, wide and nearly flat and roofed over by the overhang so that the sky above the position was blocked from view. He lay still, breathing hard, and after half a minute the second man came up beside him, then the third, then the rest, arriving in ones and twos out of the darkness below. The last rifleman pulled himself onto the ledge in the small hours of the morning. The climb had taken the better part of 3 hours. Not one man had fallen. Not one weapon had slipped from a numb hand to go clattering down the rock. Not one sound had carried the 30 feet up to the German position. 48 men who could not, by common agreement, be there, were there. Now came the hardest part of all, which was to do nothing. They could not go up, because the enemy was directly above them, and there was not yet enough light to know what waited over the lip. They could not go down, because the whole point was to be in position when the sun rose. So they arranged themselves along the ledge, and they waited for the dawn they had climbed all night to meet. Some men took small, careful sips of water. Some checked their rifles one last time, working the bolts with the taped-over metal muffled against noise. A few closed their eyes. Man Bahadur did not close his. He sat with his back to the rock and looked up at the underside of the overhang, listening to the ordinary sounds of a garrison waking up 30 feet above him. He could hear a mess tin scrape. He could hear a man cough and another laugh at something. He could smell coffee. The enemy was so close he could have hit the parapet with a thrown stone, and the enemy had no idea he existed. The sky changed slowly, the way it always does. Black went to the deepest blue, and the deepest blue went to gray, and one by one the stars gave up and vanished. Along the ledge the men's faces began to take shape out of the dark, and Man Bahadur looked at them and saw that they were ready. Rifles loaded, kukris loose in their sheaths, every eye on him, waiting for the moment. They all understood that as soon as there was enough light for a German to see down that cliff, everything would be decided one way or the other, and there would be nothing in between. That moment arrived in the shape of Willy Hartmann and his cup of cold coffee, and the 3 long seconds during which the boy's mind refused to believe his eyes. When the cup fell and Willy turned and ran, shouting, back toward the bunkers, Man Bahadur was already on his feet. He did not order his men to fire, and he did not order them to charge. He drew his kukri from its sheath and lifted it over his head, where the first hard light of the sun could catch the blade, and the polished steel flashed once like a signal mirror. And without a word being spoken, all 48 men rose together, and 48 curved blades came out of 48 leather sheaths in a single sliding sound, soft and dry, like a wave pulling back over shingle. The sound was quiet. It was also unmistakable, and it carried up over the lip of the position and into the ears of every German who was close enough to hear it, and the ones who heard it knew exactly what it meant before they even knew what they were looking at. Word ran through the garrison faster than any order could. Within a couple of minutes, every man on that spur knew that the enemy was behind the wall. Within 5 minutes, Major Heinrich Falk himself came to the back edge of the position, and he stood at the lip and looked down. And for once in his careful, unsurprised career, Heinrich Falk did not know what to do. He had held this ground for 26 days. He had broken 3 attacks and killed hundreds of men and lost almost none of his own, and he had done it all by making certain that his weapons pointed at every place an enemy could come from. And now here was the enemy in the one place he had been sure no enemy could ever be, and every gun on his position pointed the wrong way. The concrete walls he had trusted stood between him and the valley, useless. The men below him were inside his defenses, on his blind side, and there was nothing between them and his bunkers but 30 feet of rock and his own decision. Falk was not a stupid man, and he did not panic. He weighed it coldly, the way he weighed everything. He could order his men to the back edge and try to hold the top of the cliff, shooting the Gurkhas off the rock as they climbed the last stretch. His machine guns would kill some of them. They might kill many. But he had been on the Eastern Front, and he had read the reports that every German officer in Italy had read by now, and he knew what he was dealing with. He knew that Gurkhas did not stop. He had read the account of a night raid in Tunisia in which a handful of them had gone silently through a sleeping company and left 40 men dead without firing a shot. He had heard how, when a Gurkha section had once been surrounded and ordered to give up, they had answered by fixing their kukris and cutting a hole straight through the ring of men holding them. He understood that even if his guns killed most of the men on that cliff, some would reach the top. And once men like these were inside bunkers built to keep enemies out, once it came down to steel and narrow concrete corridors where a machine gun cannot swing and a rifle is too long to bring to bear, what happened next would not be a battle he could win. It would be a slaughter, and most of the bodies on the floor would be wearing his uniform. He looked at his own men, and their faces told him what he already knew. They were good soldiers, steady under shell fire, unshaken through 3 assaults. But not one of them wanted to meet those blades in the dark of a bunker, and he could not honestly say he wanted it for them. Falk leaned out over the edge and called down in the rough English he had picked up somewhere, telling the men below that they had climbed well but that they were trapped, that they could neither come up nor stay where they were, and that if they surrendered now, they would be treated properly under the rules of war. Man Bahadur said nothing at all. He looked up at the German major, and he raised his kukri again, and he held it there, the blade steady in the morning light. Along the ledge, 47 other men raised theirs, and the message needed no translation. It was not the men below who were trapped, it was the men above. "You may surrender," the raised blade said, "or you may fight us. But if you choose to fight, we are already inside your wall, and your guns and your concrete will not save you, and we are coming up whether you shoot or not." Falk stood at the edge for a long time. Nobody who saw him could say afterward what passed through his mind, but they could see it cost him something. He had a record built on never losing ground, and his superiors expected him to fight to the last cartridge, and part of him surely wanted to. But he had 130 men behind him, and he could count, and the arithmetic of what would happen in those bunkers was not in doubt. In the end, he made the choice that takes more courage than a charge, which is to decide that the lives of your men are worth more than the shine on your own reputation. A little after 7 in the morning, roughly 2 hours after Willi Hartmann dropped his coffee, white cloth appeared at the mouths of the bunkers on Falk's spur. His soldiers came out with their hands raised and their weapons left behind. 130 men who had held one of the strongest positions on the mountain for the better part of a month gave it up without firing a single shot. Man Bahadur and his 48 climbed the last stretch of rock and stepped over the lip and took the surrender. The position that had cost close to 400 Allied casualties in 3 attacks fell for the loss of nobody. Not one Gurkha had been killed. Not one had even been wounded. The arithmetic of it was almost hard to believe when they wrote it down afterward. 200 infantry had charged the front of that spur and gained nothing and lost 80 men in a few minutes. Tanks had gone up the flank and lost 3 of their number and taken not a single bunker. Hundreds of shells had come down and cracked not one wall. And then 48 men had gone up the back of it in the dark, with knives, and taken the whole thing before breakfast without spending a life. What happened next was stranger than the climb, and in the long run it mattered more. Soldiers talk, prisoners talk to their guards, and guards talk to the next prisoners, and the story of the back cliff at Falk's Spur went through the German positions on that mountain faster than any dispatch. It changed shape a little with each telling, the way such stories do, but the heart of it stayed the same, and the heart of it was terrifying. The enemy could come from the cliffs. The enemy could come from the one direction you had decided you did not need to watch. Within 4 days of Falk's surrender, more than a dozen other German positions on that mountain gave themselves up, several of them to Gurkha units that had done nothing more than appear at the bottom of their hills and start looking upward. One garrison near the northern end of the sector sent out white cloth before the Gurkhas below them had made a single move to attack. The officer commanding it sent a short message with his surrender, and it said only that his men had cliffs behind them too, and that he did not intend to wait and find out whether ropes were even necessary. Another position, which Allied intelligence had believed was good for weeks of resistance, quit on the second day. When a British officer later asked its commander why he had given up ground he could have held, the German answered that he had heard exactly what had happened to Falk, and that a man did not need to be told the same lesson twice. The fear had done what the artillery could not. It had gotten inside the walls, because the men behind them could no longer trust that a wall was a wall. The German army responded the way armies always respond to a new kind of hurt, which is with paper. A tactical instruction went out to units in the theater with a fresh section added to it, and the section dealt with the possibility of infiltration by climbing troops. It told officers to post sentries on every approach to a position, including rock faces that looked too steep to bother guarding, and it told them to assume that any cliff under a certain height could be climbed in darkness by men trained to do it. Most striking of all, it advised that when such troops were found to be already inside a position, a commander should weigh surrender seriously rather than commit his men to close fighting against them, because the losses in that kind of fighting had proven to be more than the German army could afford. An enemy who had, until a few weeks earlier, been dismissed as picturesque hill soldiers with old-fashioned knives, had earned a paragraph in the manuals telling German officers, in so many words, to give up rather than face them. The men who had done it went back to being soldiers. There was more mountain to take and more war to fight, and the story that would later fill training courses and museum plaques did not, in the moment, buy them so much as a day's rest. But something had shifted around them, quietly, in the minds of the officers who had once looked at them and seen only muscle. Man Bahadur had not merely been brave, and everyone who thought about it honestly understood that. He had been clever in a way the staff colleges had not been. He had looked at the same hill the generals had studied for a month and seen the one thing all their maps and all their training had missed. After that hill, the British were a little quicker to ask their Gurkha and Indian and African soldiers what they thought could be done, and a little slower to assume that good ideas only came down the chain and never up it. It was not a revolution, but a door that had been shut opened a crack, and men walked through it who would not have been let near the room before. Heinrich Falk spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp and lived a long time afterward. Years later, an interviewer who tracked him down asked him the question everyone wanted answered, which was how he could have surrendered a position that had beaten everything thrown at it, when he still had more men and more guns than the ragged band on the cliff below him. Falk did not answer quickly. He was an old man by then, and he had clearly turned it over many times. He said that he had not been beaten by numbers, because he had the numbers. He said he had been beaten by men who had decided, before they ever started climbing, that the wall in front of them was not a reason to stop, and that this was a thing you could not shoot. He did not think he had been a coward, and he did not much care whether other people did. He had gone home to a wife and a family after the war, he said, and so had 130 of his men, and he had never once been sorry that they had walked down that hill alive instead of being carried out of it. As for Man Bahadur, the army gave him its highest decoration for what he had done, and he carried the medal home to Nepal when the war ended and put it away and rarely spoke of it. He went back to the same steep fields he had left as a boy of 17. He kept goats and grew barley and raised his children on the side of the same mountain that had taught him, without ever meaning to, the one skill that would break a fortress no shell could touch. Neighbors knew he had been a soldier, and knew there was a medal somewhere in the house, but they got very little in the way of war stories out of him, because he did not think of it as a story. He thought of it as a night's work that had gone well. When people pressed him, the most they usually got was a shrug and a few words to the effect that he had done what needed doing, and that plenty of other men had done more. He had watched 48 of his riflemen go up an impossible cliff and come down with a fortress in their lives, and to him that was not the sort of thing you boasted about. It was the sort of thing you were quietly, permanently grateful for. The cliff itself outlasted all of them. Long after the war, soldiers from many countries came to look at it, and some of them tried it in daylight with ropes and modern gear and a full night's sleep, and plenty of them did not make it to the top even then. Special forces units used it as a training site and a hard lesson, and instructors would stand their students at the bottom, let them crane their necks up at the pale, sheer face, and then tell them that 48 men had gone up it in the dark, without a rope, carrying 60 pounds each, and had done it in near silence with 130 enemies asleep above them. The students never quite believed it at first. That was rather the point. The whole reason the thing had worked was that it was unbelievable, and it had worked precisely because the men on top had believed it too. If you want a lesson out of it, and people have pulled several, the plainest one is probably this. The Germans lost that position not because their wall was weak, but because they had stopped looking at one side of it, and they had stopped looking because everyone agreed that side was safe. The strongest defense in the world is worthless the moment your enemy is standing somewhere you were certain he could never stand. And the men who put him there were not the men with the heaviest guns or the newest machines. They were a group of quiet farmers from the far side of the world who had spent their whole lives learning that a wall of rock is only impossible until somebody decides to climb it. When the generals said it could not be done, they were not lying. They simply meant that it could not be done by them. It took men from the mountains to look at the same cliff and see, not a barrier, but a road that nobody else had thought to use.